No one ever looked at her twice. She was the kind of woman people passed every day. At the market, in the hallway, in the quiet corners of busy rooms, and never truly saw. Not because she lacked beauty or grace or intelligence, but because she carried herself without noise, without demand, without the hunger to be noticed. Her name was Elena. In her early 50s, Elena stood at that invisible edge of life, not young enough to be admired, not old enough to be protected. Her hair was always neatly tied back, a few silver strands catching the light when she moved. Her clothes were simple, clean, and carefully chosen. Nothing loud. Nothing that asked for attention. People called her reliable, kind, always there, but never important. At family gatherings, she was the one refilling glasses while others laughed. At work, she finished tasks quietly while louder voices took credit. In conversations, her sentences often trailed off, swallowed by interruptions she no longer fought against. And when that happened, she would simply smile. Soft smile. Polite. Practiced. The kind of smile a woman learns when she realizes the world listens more closely to those who speak the loudest, not the wisest. Every morning, Elena woke before the sun. The house was silent then, and in that silence, she allowed herself to breathe. She made her tea slowly, standing by the window, watching the sky change colors. These small moments were hers, unnoticed, uninterrupted, honest. If someone had asked her what she wanted from life, she wouldn't have known how to answer. Not because she didn't want anything, but because she had learned long ago to stop asking. There was a time when Elena had dreams. Real ones. But dreams are fragile when placed in the hands of responsibility. And Elena had carried responsibility like a second skin. Family needs, expectations, unspoken obligations. One by one, her dreams were folded neatly and placed somewhere deep inside her, where they couldn't cause trouble. People mistook her silence for contentment. They assumed she had no story worth hearing. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was the quiet weight she carried every single day. The words she swallowed. The choices she never explained. The strength it took to remain gentle in a world that constantly tested her patience. Elena didn't complain. She didn't argue. She endured. And endurance, when done quietly, often goes unnoticed. But there was something about her stillness that held power. A calm that didn't come from weakness, but from years of learning how to survive without being seen. A woman doesn't become this quiet by accident. She becomes quiet when she learns that speaking up costs too much. And yet, life has a way of circling back to the people it ignores. Of testing the ones it thinks will never push back. No one knew it yet, but Elena's story was only just beginning. Because sometimes, the woman everyone overlooks is the one who changes everything in the end. Elena's life wasn't shaped by one big tragedy. It was shaped by hundreds of small sacrifices. So quiet, so ordinary, that no one ever thought to call them sacrifices at all. Every day followed the same rhythm. She woke early, prepared the house, and made sure everything was in its place before stepping out into the world. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she believed that if everything around her stayed steady, the people she loved wouldn't have to feel the weight she carried. At work, Elena was dependable. She arrived on time, left late, and never complained. When extra tasks appeared, they landed on her desk without discussion. She accepted them with a nod and a faint smile, even when her shoulders ached and her mind begged for rest. "Thank you, Elena," they said. And that was always enough for everyone else. She had learned long ago that saying no came with consequences. Raised eyebrows, subtle disappointment, quiet judgment. So she said yes instead. Yes to overtime. Yes to covering for others. Yes to helping when no one offered to help her in return. Yes was small. But together, they built a life where her own needs slowly disappeared. Her phone was always ringing. A relative needed advice. A friend needed a favor. Someone needed a shoulder to lean on. Elena listened patiently, offering calm words and steady support, even when her own heart felt heavy. No one asked how she was doing, and she never told them. There had been opportunities, Moments where life opened a door just wide enough for her to step through. A promotion she quietly declined because it required moving away. A chance to learn something new she postponed because someone else needed her time more. She told herself she would come back to it later. Later became years. Years became habit. In the quiet of the evening, after the world had taken its share from her, Elena sat alone with her thoughts. She replayed old what-ifs not with bitterness, but with a gentle sadness she had grown used to carrying. She didn't feel angry at the people who leaned on her. She felt invisible. Sacrifice, she learned, doesn't always look like giving everything up at once. Sometimes it looks like slowly shrinking your life so others can feel more comfortable. And yet, even in all this giving, Elena never hardened. She still noticed small kindnesses. She still found peace in warm tea, soft music, and moments of quiet reflection. Her strength wasn't loud, but it was steady, built from patience, restraint, and an unspoken resilience that had become part of her bones. The world continued to take, and Elena continued to give. Until one day, life asked for something she wasn't sure she could afford to lose. And for the first time in years, Elena felt the weight of all those small sacrifices pressing down on her at once, demanding to be acknowledged. Because there comes a moment when even the quietest woman must decide how much more she can give before there is nothing left. Elena was known for her smile. It was the first thing people noticed, and the last thing they remembered. A gentle curve of the lips, calm and reassuring, never too wide, never too bright. The kind of smile that put others at ease. The kind that said everything is fine even when nothing was. She wore it everywhere. At work, when her ideas were brushed aside, she smiled and nodded as if it didn't matter. When someone else took credit for her effort, she smiled again, quietly reminding herself that recognition wasn't everything. At family dinners, when conversations flowed around her but never paused for her voice, she smiled and listened. People admired that about her. "She's so strong," they said. "So positive. Always smiling." They never asked what that smile cost her. Behind closed doors, the smile faded. In the privacy of her room, Elena allowed her face to rest. The mirror reflected a woman who looked composed, but tired. Not broken. Not defeated. Just worn down by years of carrying emotions she had nowhere to place. Sometimes she stood there longer than necessary, staring at her own reflection, as if waiting for the woman in the mirror to speak up, to finally say the words Elena had swallowed for years. But the room remained silent. There were moments, small, unexpected ones, when the weight inside her threatened to surface. Careless comment. Forgotten birthday. A promise someone made to her and never kept. Each moment chipped away at the careful balance she had built. And still she smiled. Because the world had taught her that sadness made people uncomfortable. That explaining yourself invited judgment. That strength meant enduring quietly, without making others feel uneasy. So she learned to hide everything behind that one expression. Her pain. Her regrets. Her unspoken questions. At night, when sleep refused to come, Elena lay awake replaying conversations she never finished. Words she almost said. Truths she almost shared. In her mind she spoke freely. Confident, clear, unapologetic. But morning always came. And with it, the smile returned. It became her armor. Her shield. A way to move through life without being questioned too closely. Without being asked to open doors she had carefully locked to protect herself. Yet even the strongest armor leaves marks on the skin beneath. Some days, her smile felt heavier than the silence. It stretched across her face like a mask she couldn't remove, even when her heart ached for honesty. And in those moments she wondered, quietly, if anyone would notice if she ever stopped smiling. If anyone would care. What Elena didn't realize was this. A smile that hides everything doesn't make the pain disappear. It stores it. Gathers it. Waits. And one day, often without warning, it asks to be seen. The smile the world admired so much was doing more than hiding her pain. It was holding it together. And when that smile finally cracked, everything would change. There was a decision Elena never spoke about. Not because it was shameful, not because it was wrong, but because saying it out loud would have made it real again. Years ago, before life narrowed into routines and quiet endurance, Elena stood at a crossroads. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices or sudden endings. Just a single opportunity that arrived gently, almost shyly, as if unsure it was welcome. She had been offered a position in another city. A role that recognized her ability, her discipline, her mind. It came with growth, independence, and something she hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. For the first time in years, Elena imagined a different version of herself. One who walked into unfamiliar streets with confidence. One who made decisions for herself. One who didn't disappear into the background. She didn't tell anyone at first. At night, she sat with the offer letter folded neatly in her drawer, taking it out only when the house was quiet. She traced the words with her fingers, her heart beating faster than it had in years. Fear and excitement tangled together, impossible to separate. But life has a way of complicating dreams. Around the same time, responsibilities tightened their grip. A family member fell ill. Someone needed her presence. Her absence suddenly felt like a burden others couldn't afford. "You're the only one we can rely on," they said. And Elena believed them. She weighed the decision silently as she always did, placing everyone else's needs on one side and her own on the other. The balance was never fair. It never had been. So she chose what she always chose. She stayed. The offer letter went back into the drawer. Weeks later, it disappeared beneath bills, paperwork, and the quiet proof of a life that continued without pause. No announcement, no farewell, just a door closing without a sound. No one ever knew what she gave up. And Elena never told them. Because how do you explain a dream you sacrificed willingly? How do you talk about a future you chose not to live because being needed felt heavier than being free? At first, she told herself it didn't matter. That there would be other chances. That life would eventually reward her patience. But years passed. And opportunities don't wait forever. Sometimes late at night, Elena wondered who she might have been if she had chosen differently. Not with regret. She didn't allow herself that luxury. But with a quiet curiosity that lingered like an unanswered question. That decision became a secret she carried alone. A reminder that her life wasn't empty. It was full of things she had chosen to leave behind. And perhaps that was the hardest part. Because the world saw a woman who had nothing to lose. But Elena knew the truth. She had already lost something once. And now, as life prepared to test her again, that buried decision, the one she never talked about, waited patiently, ready to resurface. Some choices never disappear. They simply wait for the moment they matter most. Elena had learned not to expect much from life. When you stop expecting, disappointment hurts less, or so she told herself. She moved through her days with careful steps, believing she had already paid her share of sacrifice. That whatever storms were meant to come had surely passed her by. She was wrong. The test didn't arrive loudly. Never does. It came disguised as responsibility. Familiar, almost comforting at first. Sudden change at work. A restructuring no one saw coming. People were anxious, voices sharp with uncertainty. And once again, eyes turned toward Elena. "You can handle this," they said. "We trust you." Trust, she had learned, often meant burden. Tasks doubled. Expectations grew heavier. Decisions others were afraid to make landed quietly on her shoulders. Elena absorbed it all, the way she always had. Without protest, without complaint. But this time something felt different. There was no acknowledgement. No support. Promises were made to her in passing. Promises of recognition, of relief, that never solidified into anything real. Meetings ended with reassurances and began again with more demands. Still Elena stayed silent. Then came the moment that cut deeper than the rest. A mistake, one she didn't make, was placed squarely at her feet. In a room full of people, her name was spoken carefully, diplomatically, but the meaning was clear. She was the safest one to blame. Elena felt the familiar urge rise. the reflex to smile, to accept, to move on. But her chest tightened. She realized something then. This wasn't just another small sacrifice. This was a test of everything she had become. Of every yes she had given. Of every time she had allowed herself to fade so others could stand taller. She looked around the room and saw faces she had supported, defended, covered for. No one met her eyes. The silence pressed in on her, heavy and unmistakable. That night, Elena didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, replaying the moment over and over. Not with anger, but with clarity. For the first time in years, she saw her life not as a series of duties, but as a pattern. One where her silence had been mistaken for acceptance. And something inside her shifted. The world was testing her again. Not with loss, but with injustice. Not with crisis, but with expectation. It was asking her the same question it always had. How much will you take? Elena didn't answer right away. But for the first time, she didn't rush to say yes either. She understood now that this moment mattered. That if she stayed silent again, she would be teaching the world exactly how to treat her. And silence, she realized, could no longer protect her. This time the test wasn't about endurance. It was about choice. And whether Elena was finally ready to choose herself, after all these years of choosing everyone else. Elena didn't change overnight. There was no dramatic declaration. No sudden confrontation. No moment where she raised her voice and demanded to be heard. That wasn't her way. And truthfully, it didn't need to be. Her silence simply changed. Where once it had been soft and accommodating, it became deliberate, controlled, purposeful. She stopped filling empty spaces with explanations. Stopped softening her words to make others comfortable. When questions came that were never meant for her to answer, she let them hang in the air. At work, people noticed the shift before they understood it. Elena still completed her responsibilities, but no longer everyone else's. When tasks were pushed toward her without discussion, she paused. When blame hovered near her name, she asked calm, direct questions. Not defensively. Not angrily. Just clearly. And clarity, she discovered, unsettled people more than anger ever could. She no longer stayed late unless it was necessary. She no longer apologized for boundaries she had every right to set. Her smile appeared less often, but when it did, it was real. First, there was confusion. People weren't used to this version of Elena. The one who listened more than she spoke. The one who didn't rush to rescue every situation. Some mistook her restraint for distance. Others assumed she was waiting to be corrected. But Elena wasn't waiting. She was watching. She began to see how quickly respect followed restraint. How silence, when chosen instead of forced, could shift the balance of power. The same people who once overlooked her now measured their words more carefully around her. And still, she remained quiet. Not because she was afraid, but because she had learned that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as composure, patience, as the refusal to be pulled into roles you never agreed to play. Home, the change continued. Elena started making small choices for herself. Simple ones. Resting without guilt, saying no without explanation, choosing what brought her peace instead of what earned approval. These weren't grand acts of rebellion. They were acts of respect. For the first time in years, she felt grounded. Not lighter, but steadier. As if she had finally placed her feet firmly beneath her own life instead of hovering at the edges of everyone else's. And yet, her silence held something else now. Resolve. The kind that doesn't waver when tested. Because Elena knew this phase wouldn't last forever. The world doesn't easily accept change, especially from someone it had grown comfortable overlooking. There would be resistance, questions, pushback. She was ready. Her silence had stopped being a shield. It had become a foundation. A quiet strength built from years of endurance, now focused into something unmovable, something undeniable. And when the moment finally came, when she would need to speak or walk away or choose differently, she wouldn't hesitate. Because this time, her silence wasn't hiding her power. It was holding it, until the exact moment it needed to be released. The moment didn't arrive with warning. No dramatic music. No raised voices. Just an ordinary day. One that looked exactly like every other day Elena had lived through. That's how life does it. It hides the most important turning points inside moments no one thinks to remember. The room was full. A meeting called to address concerns. The kind of meeting where responsibility floats in the air, waiting for the quietest person to claim it. Elena sat where she always did, near the edge, hands folded, posture calm. The discussion unfolded predictably. Words were chosen carefully. Blame was softened, diluted, passed around until it drifted once again toward her name. A familiar pressure filled the room, as if everyone was silently waiting for Elena to nod and accept what no one else wanted. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then something happened. Elena looked up. It wasn't anger in her eyes. It wasn't frustration. It was something far more unsettling, certainty. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She simply spoke the truth, clearly and without apology. She outlined facts, timelines, decisions. Each word steady. Each sentence impossible to twist. The room fell silent. People shifted in their seats. Some avoided her gaze. Others stared, as if trying to reconcile this composed woman with the version of Elena they thought they knew. She finished speaking and stopped. No explanation followed. No justification. She didn't try to persuade anyone to believe her. She didn't need to. Because the truth, once spoken plainly, doesn't ask for permission to exist. For the first time, Elena felt something unfamiliar, but right. Relief. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that settles deep in your chest when you finally stop carrying what was never yours to hold. Someone attempted to move the conversation along. To smooth the edges. To return things to normal. But normal was gone. Elena stood. The movement was simple, but it carried weight. She thanked the room for their time, gathered her things and walked out. No dramatic exit. No slamming doors. Just the sound of steady footsteps moving away from a place that no longer defined her. Behind her, conversations stalled. The moment lingered longer than anyone expected. Later, people would replay it in their minds. They would realize they hadn't just witnessed a meeting. They had witnessed a shift. A woman refusing, calmly and finally, to be the default answer to everyone else's problems. For Elena, the moment didn't feel triumphant. Felt peaceful. Because she hadn't proven anything to anyone else. She had proven something to herself. That she could speak without trembling. That she could leave without guilt. That her worth didn't depend on how much she carried for others. And the most unexpected part. She wasn't afraid of what came next. Because when a woman who has been overlooked her entire life finally chooses herself, the world has no choice but to adjust. Truth has a way of finding its moment. Doesn't rush. It doesn't force its way into the light. It waits, quietly, patiently, until silence can no longer contain it. And when it finally surfaces, it changes the way everything before it is understood. After Elena walked out of that room, the air she left behind didn't settle. Questions lingered. Conversations continued without her, but they no longer felt complete. Something had shifted and everyone could feel it. People began to look back. They replayed past moments, the projects that succeeded because Elena held them together, the crises that never became disasters because she intervened quietly. They remembered how often her name appeared at the end of long task lists, how rarely it appeared in praise. Patterns emerged. And with patterns came realization. Files were revisited, emails reread. Decisions retraced. It became clear that the mistake placed on Elena had roots elsewhere. The truth, once ignored, now stood impossible to deny. One by one voices changed. What had once been certainty turned into discomfort. What had once been confidence became hesitation. The narrative everyone had accepted so easily began to unravel. And in that unraveling, Elena's sacrifices surfaced too. Someone remembered the opportunity she had declined years ago, the one that would have taken her away. Another recalled how she stayed late, covered gaps, solved problems without ever asking for recognition. Stories emerged, small and scattered, but together they formed a picture no one had bothered to see before. A woman who had given far more than she took. The realization was sobering. Not because Elena demanded acknowledgement, but because her silence had hidden just how much she had carried. When she was called back into the conversation, it wasn't with authority or expectation. It was with caution. An apology followed. Then another. Words were offered carefully, almost nervously, as if everyone suddenly understood how fragile trust could be. Lena listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct the record further. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't need to. Because the truth had already done its work. It stood between her and the world now. Clear, undeniable, and long overdue. For Elena, the moment wasn't about validation. It was about release. Release from years of being misunderstood. Release from carrying blame that was never hers. Release from the quiet belief that if she just endured a little longer, things would eventually change. They had changed. But not because she waited. Because she spoke once. And sometimes that is all it takes. The truth doesn't shout. It surfaces. And when it does, it rewrites the story. Not just of what happened, but of who we thought someone was. Respect arrived quietly. Not with applause. Not with celebration. It came in careful words, softened tones, and the way people suddenly paused before speaking to Elena, as if weighing her presence for the first time. Doors that had once closed without notice were now held open. Opinions that had been dismissed were now requested. Her name was mentioned with a new kind of awareness. But timing, Elena realized, matters. Because respect offered too late carries a different weight. She noticed the change immediately. People listened when she spoke. They checked details twice before assigning responsibility. They asked instead of assuming. And though it was everything she had once hoped for, it didn't feel the way she imagined. There was no joy in it. Only clarity. She understood now that respect isn't something you wait to be given. It's something that either exists from the beginning, or it reveals itself only after loss. And something had already been lost. Trust. Not in others, but in the version of herself that once believed patience alone would be enough. That version of Elena had given endlessly, believing that consistency would eventually be seen. It had been seen, just not in time. Apologies came with sincerity. Explanations followed, layered with regret. Promises of change were made. Carefully, earnestly, almost desperately. But Elena listened with a calm distance. The kind that comes when you've already crossed an invisible line. She wasn't angry. She was finished. Finished accepting less than she deserved. Finished shrinking so others could remain comfortable. Finished confusing endurance with purpose. In quiet moments, she reflected on how strange it felt to be valued only after she stopped giving everything away. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sometimes the world doesn't recognize your worth until it feels your absence. And even then it may be too late. Elena didn't celebrate the shift. She didn't dwell on it either. She simply acknowledged it for what it was. A lesson learned by everyone but paid for by her. Respect had arrived. But it had arrived after years of silence, sacrifice, and overlooked strength. And she knew, deep down, that respect without understanding could never be enough to rebuild what had been worn away. So Elena made a quiet decision, one that didn't need approval or explanation. She would move forward. Not with bitterness. Not with resentment. But with intention. Because some chapters don't close with anger. They close with acceptance. And sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when respect, however sincere, comes too late to change the past. But not too late to change your future. Elena didn't leave with a speech. She didn't gather everyone together to explain her journey, or list the ways she had been overlooked. There was no dramatic farewell, no final attempt to be understood. She simply stepped forward into a life shaped by her own choices, for the first time in years. And in doing so, she taught everyone something they wouldn't forget. Her silence had never been emptiness. It had been restraint. People began to understand that the quiet ones aren't always unsure. They are often observant. That those who carry the most responsibility are rarely the loudest in the room. Elena had shown them that strength doesn't demand attention. It reveals itself when boundaries are finally drawn. The absence of her constant availability forced others to confront their own habits. Tasks were redistributed. Assumptions were questioned. Conversations changed. People noticed how often they had relied on her without acknowledging the cost. Some felt guilt. Others felt regret. But most felt something deeper, awareness. Elena's story spread quietly, not as gossip but as reflection. A reminder passed from one conversation to another. Pay attention to who's always there. Check on the ones who never complain. Listen before silence turns into distance. For Elena, the lesson was simpler and more personal. She learned that self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't require approval. It begins the moment you stop betraying yourself to meet expectations that were never fair to begin with. Her life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became honest. She chose work that valued her time. She chose relationships that felt balanced. She allowed herself rest without guilt and ambition without apology. The world around her didn't change overnight, but her place in it did. And that made all the difference. Sometimes people asked her why she never spoke up sooner. Elena would smile. Not the old smile that hid everything, but a gentle one that held understanding. Because the answer wasn't simple. Growth rarely is. Silence, she knew now, can protect you for a while. But eventually it must transform or it will trap you. Her silence had transformed. It had become a teacher. Teaching others to listen more carefully. Teaching her to choose herself without fear. Teaching the world that overlooking quiet strength comes at a cost. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. The woman everyone overlooked was never weak. She was waiting.